Hi. Welcome to the lecture on Chapter 11, Project Risk Management. So, risk management is probably one of the things that we don't do very well, and probably out of all the disciplines of project management is probably one of the ones that nobody ever masters. There's just too many things that come into play. So we're going to try to talk about understanding what risk management is, the importance of good risk management, some of the planning elements that come into play, list some common sources of risk, especially for IT projects, which are different than other projects, look at some of the processes in identifying risks, how to create, of course, what are we going to do? We've always created a list, so you got to create a risk register so you know what the risks are. So as your project is moving on, what the heck is going on with my recorder? Let me just get rid of it altogether. See if I can. Who cares? And then look at just some ways of identifying, create a risk register. Just find ways to quantify risks and how to calculate it. Maybe some of the how to apply. You did some tools, decision trees, simulations, sensitivity analysis to help provide examples using different risk response planning. Discuss how to control risks, and then maybe describing what software can help you. Okay, what's the importance of risk management? It's definitely more of an art. I don't know if it's art and science, but it's probably more of an art of trying to think about your project, identifying the risks, analyzing it, and then, of course, how do I respond to that risk throughout the project? It's in a lot of projects, it's definitely overlooked. You don't think there's any risk in an IT project. I'm just writing some new software, put a new user interface in. What could be the risk in that? But sometimes it can be crucial. Now, there's definitely a lot of studies out there saying that risk management, it definitely has probably the lowest maturity rating. So really nobody becomes an expert in risk management. Just to give you a rough idea of the different type of knowledge areas in different technologies, in some cases on a scale of 5, you can tell they're all kind of middle of the road, 3.5, maybe to 3.7, as far as being able to become even as close to in high IT, high tech manufacturing. I can get some fairly reliable cost understanding. But if you look at risk across the board, it's definitely middle of the road at best, maybe just a touch above average as far as becoming an expert or mature on it. Now, some of the benefits of risk management, some of the, if I could identify, anticipate problems and avoid them, tons of benefits. If I can prevent surprises, we know management hates surprises, so if I could anticipate them, I get a big bang for my buck. Maybe be able to negotiate myself out of problems definitely has an impact. Same thing with being able to meeting customer commitments. If I meet them, So there are tons of benefits for some of the practices in this. Now, just to give you some global issues, you look at some of when we had the bank bailout back in 2008, $700 billion. But when you start looking at surveying, financial experts, executives, basically most 70% came from, credit risk, which basically meant what? They didn't assess the rest. They were looking to we all thought they were greedy, and they just never did a good risk analysis. So it becomes a fairly big issue. Now, when we think of the term risk, we think of what? We think of negative. I mean, the dictionary says possibility of loss or injury. Negative risk just involves understanding what are the potential problems that might occur. But risk could also be positive. Positive risk are risks that could result in good things happening. Sometimes you'd actually call them opportunities. I guess depends on which way, if your glass is half full or half empty, as your personality comes into play as for which of these two approaches you take. But from the general definition, it's the uncertainty that has more of a negative impact than we look at it as far as the positive. So we end up trying to minimize the negative while hopefully maximizing the positive. Now, some of the best practices that we take, it basically means, usually most organizations make a mistake only addressing tactical and negative risk and not everything. But we need to make sure we need to widen that scope of risk management to involve both strategic risks, upside opportunities, or integrated risk management. Now, basically some of the best practices are I got to have a good working relationship between project sponsor and the project manager. If they're not on the same page, nothing can happen right. Now, if you look at risk utility or risk tolerance, basically says how much risk am I willing to take? Because there's three different types of people. You got people that are definitely, I hate risk. They take no chances at all. They're risk averse. Then you got down the other aspect, they got risk seeking. They're just your bungee jumpers, the hang gliders, who knows what. They just love that risk. They like to reach out there. They're willing to take the risk for the high reward. And then there's a group that's just, I'm relatively neutral. I want to balance between how much risk and how much payoff I get. You just kind of get a rough idea from these charts as to where maybe you got to look at your personality and say, where are you? Are you risk averse? I don't want any risk at all. Or are you a high risk? I'm probably in a little bit in the middle. I'll do some things that I like on the high end. There are some things I want to make sure I stay away from. Kind of some of the old lessons learned keep me based on this risk averse side. But as a project manager, I think kind of stay right in the middle is probably not a bad thing. So what are some of the processes that we look at? Now, you got to make sure you can plan for risk. I got this planning risk management. It's like, okay, how am I going to plan risk? Actually, you're planning for risk to decide how I'm going to approach risk management activities. I'm going to identify the risks, quantify what those risks are. I got to understand what the potential impact could be. I want to make sure I can quantify it, put numbers to it. And then I want to make sure I can plan a response if that event takes place. So I want to make sure that in my project planning process, I've identified those risk areas, put a plan together so if they occur, then I've already got a plan in place. It isn't something I'm taken by surprise on. And then in some cases, I've got to control the risk. I've got to monitor the risk identified, maybe look at if there's any new risks that are coming up, make sure that if a risk does happen, execute the risk response plan. So I've got to make sure I do controlling of it. Now, as far as where this all fits into this management summary plan, you can tell start to finish all the way through. Now, the only process is the monitoring and control pace. You got to kind of wait till the project gets started before you can do a lot. But for the most part, you're doing risk management the entire time you're being the project manager. Now, So the main output of that planning stage is your management plan. Basically has a bunch of documents. It says, hey, identified which risks are going to be, what tasks I'm going to take. So some of the documents that could be addressed, what are the methodology I'm going to use? Who's responsible? How much, budget and schedule am I willing to intake for risks? What are the different categories? The probability of this and its impact that a certain risk takes place. Make sure I understand what each of the stakeholders' tolerance for risk is. I mean, you may have a president or a CEO that's, risk averse, but he's only got one stake in it. But the financial guy is willing to say, hey, I'm willing to take a lot of risk. Usually it's flipped. Financial guys don't like taking the risks, and then I want to make sure I understand how I'm going to track it, how I'm going to document it. So all of these types of things in your risk management plan need to be considered. Now, let's start looking at some of these things. Now, a lot of us think about, okay, let's have a contingency plan. What happens if a problem occurs? So it's predefined actions. Now that's the key. It's predefined. It isn't contingency plan if it happens and you don't have any plan to cover. Now, a fallback plan is, you've developed the risks. They have a high impact on meeting the project. But if I put them into effect, I'll put these plans or actions in place to try to minimize the risks of a plan. Now, to put some of these in place, I may be set up additional funding reserves, either time or money, just in case I need to execute a contingency plan or a fallback plan. So those are just putting money aside or schedule aside. So maybe you put in a 2-month planning buffer just in case you had issues in the project, or you've put aside $2 million just in case you needed to go out and hire additional resources. So those are just management reserves that you can put in place to kind of help know that you've got something to fall back on if a risk does occur. Now, some of the common sources for IT projects, several studies show that they all share same and common risks. Potential scoring sheet, you can put together a spreadsheet to help identify and put some categories together. So here are some potential, risk topics. Do I have user involvement while I'm doing the project? Do I have executive management reply? And it's kind of one of the least risk thing is I got a focused and hardworking staff. I mean, even though it's important as far as the potential success. I mean, if I don't have user involvement, I could have a lot of hard guys people working. But if I don't have the users and I build the wrong stuff, the project's doomed to fail. Now, on broad categories, you got some things you can control. I can understand structure and process, but I may not be able to handle the market or financial risks, or a new technology comes out. Maybe I'm on the bleeding edge of a project or a manufacturing project. That becomes, something that's never been done before. So you're taking a risk. People, maybe it's a new team, a new company, a new subcontractor that you've hired, so these are the basically 5 areas that a lot of companies try to, bucket risk in. Of course, we all know things go wrong. Only 66% of the companies said they built in to their strategy, a risk management plan. Airline incidents cause concerns, especially Stop that phone. So you got German crash resulted dead due to poor mental state. Well, how do they respond? I mean, now they got to say, hey, I've got 2 people must be involved in the cockpit at one time. So, different things. So you're going to kind of go through. So the same thing we've done with activities and stuff like that, we need to break down this. So we do the same thing with risk. We do a risk breakdown structure, which is basically a hierarchy of the potential risks for a project. So it's similar to a work breakdown structure, but it just kind of says, hey, where are the potential risks? And here you got on the business side, it's competitors, suppliers, cash flow. On the project management side, it may be, did I get good estimates and I'm not communicating well, or my resources. So it varies as far as which part of the IT project right. But this kind of lets you bucket different areas of risk and associate it, because more than likely in a large IT project, you've got different business people, and you're going to go to your account managers, your vice president, your CFO to say, okay, who are my competitors? Who are my potentials? How much money do I have? You may go to the technical side. Hey, what hardware platform, what software we're going to use? It's going to be a network project. What type, what speed? So each one of these major categories, business, technical, organizational, and project management, have different risks. So I give you a little bit more of the, type of conditions, but basically in here we're going to look at the particular negative risks. If I ignore it or have an unclear analysis or don't manage it right, it could be big. But there is risk across each one of these knowledge areas, and each one's different. So it's just something as you're looking at this whole area of knowledge areas, that there is risk throughout everything we do in project management. And that's one of the reasons you have a project manager. So the question is now, as a project manager, how are you going to do it? You got to identify the risks. I got to understand what those potential events are that could hurt the project. Now, the question is what's the likelihood of it actually being discovered? And that's just kind of like, okay, I got to make sure I make a decision as to, I've identified it, but what are the odds that this problem is going to occur? Now, there's several tools that you can use. You can brainstorm. There's something we'll go through, a Delphi technique. You can interview different people. You can do a SWOT analysis. So let's go through those. Brainstorming, basically it's just a technique to attempt to generate ideas, that could cause a problem. You want an experienced facilitator to kind of run the session, but you got to be careful. Don't overuse or misuse this. So it just, even though it's a cool idea, getting ideas on the table, it can be misused very frequently. Now, the Delphi technique is used to derive consensus. So I pull a bunch of experts together, see if I can get consensus about their predictions and future options that could happen. So it does allow us to give independent, anonymous input of future events, but it basically means it uses repeated rounds of questioning and written responses, so you don't get any biases as far as oral methods like brainstorming. Brainstorming, you get people together and throwing these ideas across. Sometimes they can be biased based on who's throwing the ideas out. Having written responses, people can kind of put their ideas on paper and not be influenced by anybody else because they don't really see anybody else's responses. Another way is interviewing. Basically, it's a fact-finding technique that you can do face-to-face or phone call, email, but it's just interviewing projects with similar project experience to see if there's any things you've overlooked. And then you got SWOT analysis, strength, weakness, opportunity, and threat. but it helps identify broad categories of risks that apply. Of course, once I identify them, what do I have to do? I got to maintain a list. So the risk register is just a document that results in various risk management processes. So it's just a spreadsheet that identifies this, and what are the events and what are the probabilities that are going to occur. So it has some kind of any kind of identification number, kind of a rank, how important that risk is, name, a description, which of maybe those 5 categories. Is it business, or is it project management, or is it manufacturing? What are the major causes, and what potentially is the root cause of that? Now, triggers are indicators of it, that a symptom that actually the risk has occurred. One of the things is what is the potential responses? What do I want to have happen? Who owns the problem or take responsibility for fixing it? Maybe I don't care who did it or what caused it, but I got to know who's going to take responsibility for it. If it's financial, manufacturing, design, whatever, I need to have somebody responsible say, hey, it's your job now to fix this problem. And then, of course, what's the probability that this impact is going to have? And then, of course, the status of each risk. Did it occur? Did it not occur? It's in the process. So I need to understand. So this risk register has a lot of information about foreseeing risks on the project and how I'm going to manage it throughout the process, and a rough idea of what one would look like. Now, I got to make sure I understand if a risk is going to happen. So I got to qualitatively do an analysis, assess the likelihood and the impact of a particular risk, both on magnitude of the problem and its priority. Some of the tools you can use, probability impact matrices, top 10 ranking, maybe some expert judgment, a probability impact matrix or a chart just lists the relative probability of the risk of occurring. And then you label the risk on one hand, you give it low, medium, or high, and it calculates a risk factor. So give you a rough idea, high, medium, low, of the probability of it occurring and its impact. And you're saying, I'm going to give each of these things a certain risk. So risk 1 and 4 has a high impact and a high probability of occurring, whereas, risk 8 and 10 have low probability of occurring and maybe only a medium impact to it happening. So it's just a way of quantifying, putting a bucket as far as which ones could be the ones that you want to address more. Sometimes you can use a chart showing high, medium, low probability of failure with the consequence of failure. So different ways. So if you got low risk, medium, and high, just understanding what happens if these things occur. Now, top 10 risk tracking. Basically, it's just a qualitative risk analysis tool that helps identify the risks and maintain awareness throughout the project. So just having this top 10 just allows me to keep those in focus on a regular basis. So like here's all my risk events, and as you can see, the ranking could change from month to month. So just because in some projects week to week, day to day, but it does know that risk changes throughout the process of a project. And this is just one tool that can help you gauge how important a certain risk item is and how to just keep it in your vision so that you're always looking at it to say, hey, am I working on it? Is somebody working on it? Or are we doing the right things to avoid these situations? Now, there's a thing called a watch list, and it basically just lists of low-risk items. They're still identified as potential problems, but you just want them on the radar. So you just want to keep an eye out for them. You're not really tracking them, but just kind of watching out to make sure that they don't happen. Now, we know the story of the Titanic, but here you got, in 2012, people acknowledge that. So that story of the Titanic, even though it was throughout the world, what process did they want to go to celebrate the anniversary, 100th anniversary? Now, recent article in PMI, how to avoid the Titanic. How do I avoid thinking I've got the most important project and still watch it go under? Probability of a risk occurring. Did anybody think that there'd be an earthquake out there? Now, how do I perform this quantitative risk analysis? Now, it often follows that qualitative risk analysis and quantitative, they can be both done, but it usually follows the quality. First, I've got to qualify it, and then I got to say, okay, what's the probability that it's going to happen? So some of the main techniques for doing quantitative analysis is decision tree analysis, simulations, and sensitivity analysis. Now, decision tree and expected monetary value. And if you're on the financial side, somebody's going to say, okay, what's the cost of this actually causing, if this happens, how much money is it going to cost me? Decision tree basically is a diagramming analysis technique to help select the best course of action if certain outcomes occur. But the decision tree can help you decide which way you want to go. So you get, here's your decisions, project one, project two, and the probability of certain events happen. But then if that event happens, what is its estimated cost? So as you're looking at, if I take path one, path two, what could be the cost to the project as far as expected monetary value? And then you say, okay, what do I want to do? Maybe, so I want to go I want to go project two, and I want to go the least probable cost. I only want to go this one. I want to do project two with the probability of occurring only 1/10% or 10%. Yeah, I'm going to take this risk. But that's the negative side. But if I take project one with a probability of 20%, maybe I get a positive outcome as far as this happens. So doing the whole project, all the negatives. So doing this project says, hey, I can get a certain amount. Now, another way of doing it is simulate. So I kind of have a representation or a model of the system to analyze expected behavior. Monte Carlo analysis is one way of doing this. It provides a statistical distribution of potential, calculated result. Of course, to do this simulation, you need to have, 3 time estimates, most likely pessimistic and optimistic estimates, as far as a certain situation is concerned, and then run it through the simulation. Now, the steps of this is one, I got to assess the range of variables being considered. What am I trying to solve? What is the probability of each one happening? And then for each value, I need to select a random value based on probability distribution. And then you run the analysis, and then you repeat steps 3 and 4 to get enough probability distribution. And this just kind of gives you a rough idea of what one of these could look like as far as the schedule is concerned. Now, in all the projects I've run, I've really never needed to run this kind of analysis. Usually it's just tracking what I think the risk factors are, associating what the cost is, and maybe the resources needed to fix it, and they just monitor it. But if you get a large enough project, you may need to run this. Now, what we're right. Excel is a cool tool to be able to help you do quantitative analysis. Now, General Motors, using simulation for forecasting, has done very well. Procter & Gamble uses a model to formulate foreign exchange rates. What's it going to cost? And simulation has also been used in Agile project. So there are a lot of different expenses, but for most of us, I think Excel is probably a common tool to get a lot of things done. Now, sensitivity analysis. It's a technique used to show the effects of changing one or more variables on the outcome. What happens if I add more people, more money, and see where, if my situation changes. You can use Excel to do this. And here you're seeing this profit and loss analysis, saying, what happens if I sell more items, less more. At some point, there's this break-even point that says, hey, am I willing? And then you say, okay, can I, is it worth the risk? Now, I got to also plan my response if risk happens. So after I've identified all the risks and quantified them, now you got to say, okay, what am I going to do if they happen? And of course, there's 4 strategies involved: risk avoidance, risk acceptance, transference, or mitigation. If you look at those 4, which you think would be probably in the long run, the cheapest to do? And I think it'd probably be risk avoidance. Now, just to give, some rough ideas, you got, general risk mitigation strategies. You've got what? I've got technical cost and schedule. So I got some technical risks, there's some cost risks, and there's some scheduling risks. Now I've got, so there are some strategies you can go through. Now, strategy for positive risks, you got exploitation. I can exploit the risk, I can share the risk, I can enhance it, or I can accept it. Now, just because I've taken a risk and try to find a way to maybe mitigate it, it's also known that sometimes there could be some residual effect of a risk. So residual risks are risks that remain even after you've done everything you can do. There's still some potential residing risk that's still waiting to be happen that you still need to do. And sometimes secondary risks. So because I've made a decision to mitigate or avoid a risk, that may cause something else to be now a risk. So it could be just a result of making a decision. Now, I got to control the risks. Now, involves basically says it's now just going to execute my risk management process to respond to those risk events, to make sure that it's an ongoing activity performed by the entire team throughout the entire project. Now, in a lot of cases, we are always going to do what we call a workaround. Something's come up, unplanned result, and we're going to find out I didn't make any contingency plan, so I'm going to try some way of getting around the problem that's occurred. Because what you really want to do when you're controlling risk is I want to make sure that work performance information is identified. So how's the work progressing? What impact on time, budget, equipment? Are we changing the project? So did we put the appropriate change request in place? Of course, I've got to update schedules and project plans and organization charts maybe, and making sure everybody's informed. Now, to do some of this, you got tons of tools out there to assist this. But I think risk registers, Excel, I like Excel better than Word. But then because I can do other things with Excel that I can't do in Word. You can go get Monte Carlo simulation tools, but you can do add-ons to Excel and Microsoft Project to do a lot of these simulations. So to me, it's easier to do Excel and Microsoft Project to do some of this stuff than it is to pay for a Monte Carlo simulation for most projects we usually work on. So what's the results of good risk management? Unlike crisis management, risk management in a lot of cases goes unnoticed. Because I do risk management right, either I've avoided all the problems so they never occurred, I never hit my contingency reserves. So it almost seems like it's effortlessly, and the project manager should try to strive to make it look as easy as possible. But I guess this would be more of like a duck on water. You're pedaling really fast and you look really calm on top of the water. That's what a good project manager is going to look like. He's working really hard to mitigate all the issues, problems, and stuff to keep the project afloat and moving forward. So in this chapter, yes, you talk about risk management, but it's more of an art in identifying, analyzing, and responding to risk throughout the life of the project. So definitely several tools and processes we've talked about, from planning, identifying, performing qualitative and quantitative analysis, and then how do I respond and how do I control it. So hopefully you learned a little bit about risk management in this chapter, and I will see you in the next chapter. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.